Welcome to Decode It, a podcast series helping understand more about computer technologies and its beginnings. I'm Ashley Griffin, involved in IT from the 1980s, first with the Atari ST, then on to computer networks in the early 1990s. So, on this week's podcast for Decode It, I've got Christian Fund with me again, and we're going to have a very quick chat and some reminiscing about the Atari computers from the the end of the 1970s going through to the 1980s, and that would have predated the common PC as you would see it today in the format we've got today. Hi, Christian. How are you?
Not too bad, Ashley. Yourself?
I'm good, thank you. So, if
Yeah.
I remember rightly from our last chat, you started with the Atari 400.
Yes, I picked it up more as a game machine, the Atari 400 XL, but there were a lot of games and programs you could get off, even back then, off the internet, or few anyway. So you could learn about computing as well as playing the games. It was mostly a game machine for me, though. But
Did
yes, the 400 XL was what I started with.
you would have been in Canada at the time, correct?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Okay, so I'm coming at this from the UK perspective. I don't remember. When did you get your Atari 400?
I early 80s, I believe.
So that's interesting. Some of the research I did seems to imply that they were kind of coming up with that idea at the very end of the 1970s, like 1979. It
Mhm.
doesn't look. It looks like they may have even gone on sale at like November 1979. So it is kind of the start of the 80s.
Yeah.
So did you, when you bought that, did you choose the 400? Was the Atari 800 out then, or was the 400 the only one available?
At that time, 400 was available. I'd started with a Timex Sinclair years before, but it was limited, and the Atari 400 XL was such a upgrade. The Timex Sinclair didn't really have any games that you could play. It was simply a computer. This was the first opportunity to get into something that played the games, kept you entertained in between when you were trying to learn a little bit about computers. Actually, it probably took too much time away from the actual computing because mostly what I learned was to play games back then.
Well, most of the games you were buying Atari games, or did they
Oh
have
yeah,
other
yeah.
manufacturers?
They came from the Atari, yeah.
So that would have been probably the Asteroids. I think Space Invaders was Atari.
Oh yeah.
Um, I had a look. I had a quick look at the hardware of the Atari 400. It was pretty advanced.
Hmm.
It had a CPU and it had three processors supporting the CPU. So were the games fairly graphical and fairly good? Did you find them fairly good for the era?
Well, back then the other game machines were the Atari 2600 and of course the Commodore. I would say they were better than the 2600. They were better graphics.
The Commodore would have been what? The Commodore 16?
I think didn't it start with the Commodore 64? Wasn't that the first one?
No, I'm sure there was one before that. You had the Commodore PET. While you reminisce on that, I'm going to see what I can find. No, I'm fairly sure there was the Commodore PET before the 64. The 64 was a later generation early machine. Let me just have a look here.
Hmm.
Um,
No,
oh
yeah,
yeah,
you're
so the
right. The Commodore Kim was the first one from 76 to 80, wasn't it?
yeah, actually, the Commodore 64 was early. I mean, it was August 1982, so that was an early machine. Which one did you say was? Did you find before that one?
Well, there was a Commodore VIC 20,
Oh yeah,
Commodore PET, and even before that was some a Commodore Kim 1. I'm just looking it up right now.
the PET is more of a looks like more of an industrial machine.
Yeah, it looks like the screen and the keyboard and all was all in one, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's kind of what it's looking like. I'm just looking at the VIC-20. Well, the
Yeah.
VIC-20 is more of a computer. When was that out?
81 to 85.
Yeah, so it probably was the VIC-20 first.
That would have been in competition with it, yeah.
So if any of the listeners, I'm sure there are listeners that are going to be way more savvy on the dates on this than we are. We're kind of just trundling through the internet and reminiscing about what we were doing. I didn't realise that the Commodore 64 was that early, um, and it had a
And
very good sound chip in that Commodore
and
64.
I'd actually forgot about the VIC 20, but which was before that
Yeah, and the
until I
Vic
looked it up just now. Yeah.
and the VIC 20 looks fairly similar to the 64, so you can kind of see where they went with the design on that. Um,
Hmm.
so, did you know anyone with a Commodore 64 or that?
I did not. No.
Okay,
It was easier to find the Atari. There were a couple of stores There was one store in Kitchener dedicated to that with all kinds of software. So it was much easier to get that than the VIC 20 and the other Commodores around. Better support for them.
so and that's kind of interesting because I mean, clearly there was a war between those guys. You had Atari that made the arcade games.
Hmm.
Um, which ironically Steve Jobs used to work for Atari. Yeah, before he left and started
Oh
off.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, in fact, that's arguably why I think it was called Apple, was to get their name above Atari because it was AP instead of AT.
Oh,
It was.
okay.
I watched a thing on that. It was kind of interesting. So yeah, back in Europe. So I was at school in the mid to late 80s or secondary school. Actually, let's put some time dates on this. So I 85, yeah, 85 onwards, I was at secondary school, so that would have been from 13 to 16 years old.
Hmm.
Previous to that, I didn't really hear about PCs. So in the primary school, we more had Game and Watch, which was Nintendo. Um,
Hmm.
at the secondary school, generally I heard about the Commodore 64. So people were buying those probably in 83 and 84, and they were very
Hmm.
big. There were magazines there for them. I remember when I was looking at a computer, which probably would have been 85 or 86.
Hmm.
The Atari did not, or I say the Atari did not have any magazines, mainly because they really didn't exist or just started. The Commodore magazines were all in US dollars. So any magazine you bought, the price was in US dollars. So they didn't really have that much of a foothold for the Commodore Amiga in the UK. But the Commodore 64, sure, that was kind of very prevalent and they kind of stuck with it. So you had the Atari 400. Did
Yes.
you, how many games did you have for that?
Oh, probably cartridge games that you could plug in, probably about 12 or 13. But there were also some games you could get on floppy disk from some of the magazines and such.
Oh, yeah.
Downloading from the internet was not really much of an option back then for game size, right?
I remember that. You used to get
Mhm.
software onto the magazines. So when
Mhm.
you had the Atari 400, where did you go from there? Because if memory serves, you did have an Atari ST.
Yeah, so I'm just looking it up. The Atari 400 started in 79. 400 and 800 were released then, so we were pretty close in that. So my brother had the Atari 520, and he ended up getting the 1200. or- Yeah, sorry, the 1040. So he gave me the 520, and at that point, I gave away my 400 to another friend of mine. So they just kind of passed down. So that would have been about 3, 4 years after. So probably mid 80s.
Do you remember which Atari ST you got? Was it the STF, the STFM? Are you not sure?
Well, it was a 520. I think the 520 only had the ST, didn't they?
Yeah, the ST was the generation, so it was called an Atari ST, but they did
Yeah.
an F and an FM. So the F was a frequency modulator, No, the F was a floppy drive, and the M was the frequency modulator to allow you to plug it into the TV.
Okay.
So
Well, as I recall, the 520 ST I had, it had a built-in floppy drive, single side, and it had to go into a monitor.
so you
But
probably had the STF,
okay.
and very quickly at that era, they then built in the modulator, so they had an STFM.
Hmm.
I think when they did that, the floppy drive then became double-sided.
Okay.
So they upgraded the floppy drive. Um, I had one as well, and I tried to do a bit of research on this. I don't remember when I got it, and mine would have been a 520 STFM.
Okay.
Uh, I know I sold that, and I found the receipt. I sold that on the. I'm just looking now. Second STFM. 19th of May 1990. I actually sold the Atari ST
Hmm.
because I've got an Atari STE, which was the newer generation, and that's got the Blitter chip on board. And it had the SIM memory, so you could put SIM memory in it instead.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, that. So the main upgrade was they removed the onboard memory from onboard chips. If memory serves, a lot of the later generation 520 STs you had onboard memory location for to upgrade to 1040.
Oh, yeah.
You just had to buy the memory and plug it in.
Hmm.
Of course, and as you said, there was no internet back then, so that sounds easy, but you couldn't just type it in a browser and find it.
True.
Then the STE they moved to SIM memory on board and a Blitter chip. So basically, it was a facelifted ST, and the E stand for enhanced. Um, I had that, and clear that didn't get sold to the late 1989. So that's clearly what happened here. I bought one and then sold the STE, or yeah, my STFM, and I sold that to someone, and I found a
Hmm.
receipt for it. Now, that's interesting to me because I had my Atari when I was at school, so that's clearly where I was getting the games from at that point, or and communicating and socializing, and other people having the Atari. So we
Hmm.
had it was a split. We had the Atari when the Atari ST came out. There was a lot of people still with the Commodore 64, and I remember having that. So I don't really know why I bought the STE because I would have left school by then. So that may explain why it's kind of in its box and didn't get used much.
Yeah, but you had you saw the potential in it, but then you got into something else. It's not
What?
the first time that's happened to us.
Well, I mean, I left school, so like a lot of your habits would have stopped, and my software supply at the time would have stopped. I still do have the software. In fact, I've just moved it. I've got four floppy disk boxes, which I think they carry 80 disks each, and they're all full.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so I've still got a lot of software. I now have them on the PC, and I've got an emulator, so I've got them, and I know I can use them. So what did you
That's a good
find?
idea because you know how floppy disks can sometimes degrade, right? With
Oh
heat and
yeah,
whatever else.
I would be surprised if any of these still work.
Hmm.
I have them; they've been stored in a dry location, but you know they are 40 years old.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I would be surprised if they do read, and I would be surprised if the Atari still works. I should really get it out of the box, but it hasn't been powered on for. Let me have a stab here. 30 years.
But you know what? Some of those old electronics, they don't degrade like some of the newer ones, you know? The
I
software, yeah, what they can do, but the hardware itself probably could stand up.
So with the Atari, I don't know whether that will work. Now I also have a Commodore Amiga 500, and
Oh yeah.
that I put a 300 megabyte hard drive in, I remember doing that because I had to cut the steel to get it in there.
Hmm.
I have that. That's at one of our offices again in the retail box. We have the retail box for that. I haven't
Hmm.
powered that up in that's got to be 30 years. Now, the drive probably would work in it, but I don't know whether the Amiga would.
Hmm.
So, yes, I have a Commodore Amiga, which I didn't really use. And I bought that because I don't know if you know, the Atari went end of life 1993. Yes, they decommissioned everything in 1993.
Oh, okay.
So I bought a Commodore Amiga to kind of trying to move forward. Now, we were
Hmm.
talking before about some of the history with Atari
Hmm.
before we started the show. Very interesting learning curve. So, Trammell, who created the Atari ST, he actually worked for Commodore and left
Hmm.
and got the IP. It looks like he got the IP from Atari. So the 400 and the 800 were built by Atari. They weren't selling. I think they were sold like 60,000 units as against Commodore's 1 to 2 million. So Trammell wanted to invent a computer and he went through a number of CPUs, but he sat on the 6800, which is what's in the Atari. And the ST stands for 1632 because of the architecture of the CPU.
Oh, is that what it's for? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a 16 external bus, 16-bit external, and 32-bit internal. Um,
Hmm.
he designed it. They designed it from the ground up. He also got the engineers that were working at Commodore. They all left and all worked on the Atari. So the irony here is really the Atari is what probably the Commodore Amiga could have been
Hmm.
if he hadn't left Commodore. But I'm guessing there were conflicts of interest in what he wanted to do. So he built
Hmm.
a computer with the Atari name on it because he could. And it was a good machine. I mean, it had MIDI ports built in it, so the music guys used it.
Definitely.
It had the expansion port on the left that I used for both sound and video. So that's what happened. Now, as you then get to the late 90s or the late 80s, so 89, technology started to increase very quickly. I looked at some of the Atari Falcon, which was the replacement for the STE,
Hmm.
and I mean that had like an internal buffer of 4 meg. I mean, you couldn't get 4 meg of memory on the Atari; like, it was difficult to find it. So that will
Hmm.
give you an idea on how quickly the technology was pacing back at that era. But of course, they did come out with the Falcon, but it was very short-lived.
Yeah, I remember hearing the name, but I don't think. At that time, they were also introducing the Atari 400 game system, which was a video game console that they put a keyboard on instead of selling the 400 and 800. They'd sell a 400 and 800 game system that you threw a keyboard on afterwards.
Was
What do they
that
call that? The Atari XE?
when did that come out?
About just before the Falcon, I think.
Well, that would be interesting because that probably wasn't done by the same. Oh, that wasn't done by Trammell, was it?
I couldn't tell you.
I'm just looking here now. Atari 400 wiki. That's probably yeah. See, that's going to get me 8-bit, and the 8 bits ended. The Falcon. Let me have a look. So
Yeah, let's see. It says here it came out 87 to 92.
what was it
When was the
called?
Falcon?
Oh, the Falcon was 1992.
Oh, okay. So this was much earlier than the 87 to 92. So it was about
No,
the same
it
time.
was about the same time.
Yeah. So
What was it
the
called?
XE was basically a game console with a keyboard with a trackball on the keyboard.
You said it was what was it? A 400 XL?
Well, I think it was capability was the same as the 400 XL.
Yeah, I'd need to spend a bit more time looking for that. I don't
Yeah,
actually
it
remember.
says here it launched right after the Atari 7800.
Oh, so maybe that was by Atari directly then,
Could be.
because the Atari ST wasn't done by Atari. That was Trammell,
Hmm.
and that it was licensed from Atari, so that's why you could have the Atari name. But arguably, they were different machines. You
Oh,
know,
for sure.
like the Atari ST was a 6800 Motorola processor. I'm just looking at the Falcon. So the Falcon was 1992, which was really quite late. Discontinued a year later, and it was running. That was running some pretty powerful stuff. It had two processors. It had a 68030 and it had a 56001. That was a pretty powerful machine. So I won. That's a bit of a shame that really didn't take off.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it had also it had a Motorola 56001 DSP, so it had a digital sound processor in it. That'd have been really good for the music industry. Oh, and it could play MP3 files in real time.
Back at that time.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes,
That is something.
that was a pretty. So that could have been the drum machine and the sound machine. What the Atari did for MIDI, that would have done for digital music, but it just didn't stick around.
Yeah.
It was done by a
It has to
company.
be around for people to catch on to some of the extra features, right?
Yeah, and the Atari computer, Atari computer just didn't stick around. I'm looking here, so it's a 68030 16 megahertz processor. It had an MMU in it. It was socketed. Was it optional? Oh, it was an optional socket. It came with a 56001 DSP chip at 32 megahertz with 16 MIPS. That was basically a pretty powerful graphics chip.
Hmm.
It could do 16 or 18-bit color. I'm trying to find the resolutions for it. Oh, it was 640 by 480. Yeah, so it basically did VGA.
Yeah.
Yep,
It's pretty good.
that would have been a very nice machine. And if that had continued, that would have been a very good computer and a games machine.
Hmm.
Memory, oh, you could get 4 or 14 megabytes of memory. That was quite a powerful machine as well. So with your Atari, what did you do with the Atari? Was it mostly games, or the Atari ST? Was it mostly games?
Oh, it would have been mostly games. I did try the writer program on the ST and spreadsheet, but that was just trying to learn things on there. Didn't really do anything practical with it, to be honest.
I did some programming, so I had STOS, or as it was pronounced, STOS, which was the programming language that you could compile to executables.
Hmm.
I did have that, and I kind of liked that, but didn't really have any reason to write anything. Um,
Hmm.
I also had the writer and the spreadsheet. I remember using the I think the writer. I was doing invoices on that and orders.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I did use it for business. Yeah, because my original invoices were done on there, and I was using that for business in the early 90s. And I had a pretty sizable uh, Micronics Star LC 24200, which was the wide carriage dot matrix printer, and I had a feeder in it so I could load paper in it, and it would automatically take the paper.
Oh
So
yeah.
I was raising invoices on that machine. I'm
Hmm.
guessing one of the floppy disks I've got has probably got all the backups of those documents.
Oh yeah.
I'm
You don't
just
throw anything away, do you?
no. Well,
No.
there
No.
were, I do. Yeah, yes and no. I still have all of this stuff from the Atari.
Yeah.
I've even got an external Atari floppy disk drive box that I never threw out, like it's new
Hmm.
and never used. I'm just looking at the Falcon here. The Falcon actually, interestingly, They went for a standard floppy disk on the right hand side with a standard window, like the oblong window. They've gone
Okay.
standard, and they just made a hole in the sides of the case. I wonder if that was a prototype. And also the logo changed; it was multicolored. Oh, and the keys were darker. It had dark grey keys on the Falcon keyboard. Now, I generally don't. I haven't thrown anything away from the Atari. I have sold some magazines. I still have a lot of the magazines, like ST Action. I've got issue number 1 of that. ST Format. I think I have issue number 1 of that as well. So I've still got those on. I would like to probably get rid of them to someone that would collect them or want them. They're still in very good condition. So what did you do? What did you end up doing with your Atari ST eventually?
Actually, I think I passed that on to another friend of mine when I was done with it. At that point, the place I used to get the software and whatnot, they simply got out of that and they went into PCs. So really, there was not much other places to get games or software for it. There was no support left for it at that time. So I gave it to a friend of mine who could use what was with it. And actually, I never heard from him again about anything about the computer itself. And then I tried to learn about the IBMs because that's what we were using at work.
Did
So
did were there a lot of stores in Canada that sold games generally?
uh, you found there was one in Kitchener that would deal with Atari for games. The PCs were a lot more common. I mean, the big box stores, the department stores were getting into them. Some of these Dutch computers, what were they? Amstrad.
Oh,
They were
Amstrad.
big. Amstrad computers. They were selling in a lot of stores there, and yeah,
The
they
Am
were IBM.
the, A, the Amstrad.
Amstrad. Okay, sorry.
Well, there's a reason I'm going to mention this. AMSTRAD actually stands for Sir Alan Michael Sugar Trading.
Interesting exchange there.
I bumped into a it was a podcast, or it might have been a TV show, where he happened to drop that without being asked.
Mhm.
It's Alan Michael Sugar Trading. That's where you get the word Amstrad from. But that's kind of interesting because Amstrad wasn't just PCs; like they did TVs and videos and a lot of stuff.
Mhm.
So he had his fingers in a lot of pies. I remember the Amstrad. There was the PC 1520 and 1640,
Mhm.
and that would have been the 512 memory, the 1520, and the
Mhm.
640 memory was the 1640. Um, and now in the UK, most most convenience, well, not convenience stores. So WH Smith's, which sold magazines.
It was a bookstore, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it was a bookstore, pens, magazines. They sold games.
Mhm.
Um, Boots, which is cosmetics, they sold games. There wasn't many of them, but most retail stores in the UK sold the games, and from memory, they were still selling games for the ZX Spectrum, the Atari, the Commodore Amiga.
Mhm.
PCs were a lot slower, but that market remained quite high for quite a long time until probably the Xbox came out. Let me have a look to
Mhm.
see when that appeared. Xbox. Uh, I think the Xbox. Well, really, the Xbox was first, wasn't it? Because we're both at the age where we weren't really gamers.
The Xbox came much after the Amstrad.
Yes, the Amstrad was first because that was a PC.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the Xbox was 2001. But I
There's quite a few different years difference in there, isn't there?
yeah, it was 10 years. So
Yeah.
previous to that, you did have other gaming systems. You had the Sega. You had the Sega 8-bit system, which was about the same time. That was the late 80s. And then you had the Sega 16-bit system, and then you had the Nintendo. So what happened in the UK was they were selling games for, the Nintendo or the SNES, the
Hmm.
Sega, but they continued to sell it for the ZX Spectrum and the Atari and the Amiga. The
Hmm.
PC really didn't get a look in until properly until the Xbox when that engine started to come up with the graphics card. But the game still primarily came out on the other systems. Let me just have a look here. Sega 8-bit. Yeah, so the Master System.
That's
Uh,
the Sega Master System.
yeah,
Yeah.
that was 86.
That came after the Sega Genesis, though, didn't it?
No, Genesis was afterwards.
Oh, was it?
The Master System was the first gaming console. Let me just have a look at to answer your question. So Sega, you said Genesis, didn't you? Yeah, Genesis. I think
Yeah.
it's 32-bit. Oh yeah, so Sega Genesis was a marketing in the UK or Europe. It was called the Mega Drive, not the Genesis.
Ah.
I think. Yeah, that was 88. So the Master System was first, and then the Genesis came out afterwards. The problem was, like you said, I mean, they were gaming systems, so you couldn't really
Mhm.
do computer stuff on them. Like you were kind of stuck with if you wanted a gaming system, but that's what the games come out for. Now we kind of bumped into this earlier before we started the podcast. Sega have jumped out of the gaming industry or the retail gaming industry. Like they've left that to Xbox and PlayStation or Sony, citing that it was cheaper or they preferred to write games and license them to run on other systems than to have build their own gaming system. So they still make arcade games. They just don't make they don't make a games console.
Yeah.
And Atari, very similar. Like they Atari cited they weren't selling a lot of computers, so Trammell got the IP license to build a computer with Atari on it. Built the Atari ST. But really, I mean, that was short lived. I mean, because what was that, 84, 85 to 93?
Yeah.
Like
Not a long life for a computer, really.
no, 8 years. Especially when they probably do. I mean, they still work now, so they were constructed very robustly.
Mhm.
Yes, it isn't a long life. So technology was moving on quick enough for them really to be obsolete quite quick,
Yeah.
technically. I'm just looking here. There was quite a few processors in this Sega Mega Drive.
Just looking here for the dates, and I see that games like the Tomb Raider. I don't know if you remember hearing about that.
I do.
Yeah. So I mean, that's one of the ones I played on the PC, and that came out for the Sega Saturn and the PC about the same time. So at that point, a lot of a lot of these console games were coming out at the same time as a PC,
Yeah,
or within a year anyway.
yeah. I mean, that's early, well, mid 90s. What was that? 94.
Yeah, it says here, yeah, 94, 95.
Yeah, because you would have had graphics cards from my memory. You would have had graphics cards running at 800 by 600 res,
Mhm.
16 million colors then, which was
But see, the thing is, at that point in time, I mean, if they came out with a new game like Tomb Raider, they came out with a newer version of it that needed more video card. Well, you can't update a console,
no. Yeah.
and that was actually done by EDOS, which is an after not a it's a software company that isn't associated with the PC or any
Oh yes. Yeah.
console, right?
It's an independent developer.
So it would pay them to program for as many different systems as possible, right?
No, you're right. I mean, when you paste that kind of resolution against an Atari ST, Like that ST's, I mean, it's going to run at 16 colors.
Hmm.
It's just the game's just not going to look good.
Right.
Yeah, no, I do agree with you. I mean, with PCs, you had it was more who put the graphics card in.
Yeah.
So
Well, one of the things I ran on the Atari ST was a flight simulator,
which one did you
and
run?
it was also able to get an RC flight simulator.
Oh,
That is to say, you remember that you know the RC controllers for remote
yes,
control aircraft.
yeah.
It's able to get a controller that would plug into the ST along with flight sim software that lets you simulate gliders and other planes. But of course, the screen was just two colors, right?
I remember. You know what? I remember that.
Yeah, that was mostly for my father because he was into the RC aircraft. So in the winter time, he could sit there, and it was quite capable. I mean, you could modify the updrafts on it for gliders. You could go in there and change all the settings to increase the lift on hills and various. The graphics weren't, like anything like what you see in the flight simulators nowadays. But I did. There was not another machine that I knew of that had the RC flight simulator with a real RC controller.
Did with your father? Did he say that that was quite accurate?
He seemed to think so. Yeah. I mean, you were able to train with the two gimbal sticks, which
Yes.
none of the other flight simulators. All the other flight simulators, you had to learn the keyboards, and it didn't train you to react the way you would out in the field with the actual RC aircraft, right?
Well, that's what I'm thinking here because I do remember that because I
Mhm.
had Microsoft Flight Simulator. I found it in some software downstairs, still sealed, I think it was. And when I was
Not
doing
for the ST though, was it?
no,
Oh,
no,
okay.
no, no, it was that was for the PC. But when I was
That's
doing the
excellent.
research for that, I bumped into that controller you were on about, and I
Right.
remember reading about it that it plugged into the PC.
Hmm.
Um, Now that would have been very interesting because I've flown helicopters.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I I I I went through the path to try and do a commercial license, which I'm still looking at now. But as we spoke about with company and what's going on there, I don't know what I'm doing with that yet. I've
Hmm.
seen a lot of software that's still being written for the Atari ST that
Hmm.
is really good. Like now we've learned about compression, how to do compression, how to decompress it on the fly
Hmm.
in a very small space. That I've seen some software, and I've said to them, "Could you have done this 30 years ago? 40 years ago?" And he said,
Hmm.
"Yes." He said, "This is not a modified Atari. Like, and I'm putting it on a floppy disk." He said, "Yes, I could have done that." But he said it's
Hmm.
taken 30 years of learning. This is the best way to do compression on the fly.
Okay.
For that to work. But he did say
Right.
yes. He said if I had a time machine, I could send this floppy disk back. And I looked at this, and I mean, the guy looked like he was at like god level programming. If I'd seen that 30 or 40 years ago in a magazine, I'd have claimed that was fake.
Yeah.
No, and
Yeah. I believe it. It's
he
just too far,
yeah,
just way beyond the capabilities of the time. You would have, wouldn't you?
yeah, and it just goes to show the robustness of the Atari and how it was developed. That we're still learning about it now and what you could still do in it. Okay, I think so. I think we've done a lot of the historic Atari computers. So it was very interesting to see the difference as well between the Canadian market and the Canadian process of where you didn't find games, and the
Hmm.
European side from the UK where the games were pretty accessible. And the accessible meant that the system kept going and really till they went end of life
Yeah.
because the games just stopped writing for them. So they moved. They moved where I was. They moved from the Atari to the SNES and the Sega.
Hmm.
I think SNES. So the Nintendo system took off more than the Sega did. and that's where the game.
Yeah, I think as far as the home use, then Nintendo did a little bit better than Sega here as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Sega, and again, Sega are out of the market. They don't make game systems anymore.
Mhm.
They do write games, so they don't do the system. And it's the same
Mhm.
with Atari. They jumped out of that because they really weren't selling much of it. And then
Mhm.
that's where you had Trammell get the IP, build the Atari ST, which kind of then failed pretty quickly within 8 years, 8 or 9 years. But it looks
Mhm.
like they're still trying to get back into that market, which we kind of touched on, or maybe we didn't. The new 400, which kind of looks like it's got a keyboard on it, but actually isn't a computer.
Right. It looks like Atari's in the last 5 years. I think they. We shouldn't get too deep into this, but I would quickly say they've come up with like 5 different game consoles, and like you say, the 400 mocks is a mock of the computer, but the keyboard is simply for nostalgia.
Yeah, and it
Yeah.
doesn't even look like a proper keyboard. It's just a sticker.
Oh, it looks like it's about 5 inches wide.
Yeah, yeah. No, so I think on this occasion it's been very good to kind of reminisce on the Atari. Um,
Yeah.
Very interested to learn the differences between the two markets and the gaming. That would explain why gaming kind of persisted in the UK a lot more. It was
Mhm.
just more accessible than Canada was. Your stores were a lot more distanced apart, and they clearly would sell
Mhm.
less as well. It's been very good. So, Christian, I'm sure we'll come up with another podcast subject of some description, and we'll speak again in the very near future.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of topics we've mentioned going through here that we meandered into that could be dwelt on a lot more time.
Yeah, it's good. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you very
All
much,
right.
and have a good afternoon.
All right. And the best to you, Ashley.
All right, I'll
You
see you
take
soon.
care.
Thank you for spending some time with me. Subscribe to see more in the Decode It series.